And we're live.
Hey, we're live at the Glenn Show. Welcome, everybody, to the Glenn Show. I am Glenn Loury, host, and you are joining us live here on July 31st, 2026. My guest for the next 2 hours will be Delano Squires, who's director of the DeVos Center for Human Flourishing at the Heritage Foundation and author of the new book, The Vanishing Black Family: How Welfare and Feminism Made Marriage Optional and Children Vulnerable. So welcome, Delano.
Thank you for having me, Glenn.
We are also joined by Robert Patton-Spruill, friend of the show, filmmaker and commentator here at the Glenn Show on occasion, and Mark Sussman, who is the editor and writer for GlennLowry.substack, and who is going to give you a few opening instructions about how to participate in this significant event that we're having here, which is talking to Delano Squires about his book. Mark.
All right. Hello. Welcome to the Glenn Show Live. If you are joining us here, you are joining us here. Normally, this is a behind the paywall affair, but we decided today's conversation is something we want to open up to everybody. So we have not paywalled this. So we're getting people from all over watching either via YouTube or via Substack. So we thank you for showing up, but we especially thank our full subscribers who subscribe over at GlennLowry.substack.com or through our YouTube members programs. Now, you don't just get occasional live streams if you are a subscriber through those venues. You get everything. You get everything every week. You get everything ever posted to the Substack. You got whatever we got to give. So thank you so much. You help us keep the lights on. You know we cannot do what we do unless you do what you do. Now, we got a 2-hour show today with Delano, and I will be monitoring the chat. So if you've got a question or a comment to make, throw it in the chat, either on Substack or on YouTube, and I'll be collecting questions and comments, and at the appropriate time, we will hand them on to Glenn and make you a part of the conversation. All right, that's enough out of me. Let's go.
Hey, my old friend, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Glenn.
You know, I can listen to this conversation that we had. It's over 3 years ago now.
I know.
When we were talking about similar subject matter, and found it was so rich. I mean, there were so many different things going on. So I'm glad. And we ended by me saying I'll have to have you back. So
yes,
forgive me for taking so long, man.
No, I wanted to say publicly thank you because, and I'm not sure if I told you this already, but that conversation actually is one of the reasons I ended up writing this book. So after we spoke, my publisher from Penguin Random House reached out to me and said, hey, would you be open to writing a book about abortion and the Black family? And I said, I didn't have that book in me, but I do have a book on the Black family. She asked about abortion in the Black community. And I said, but I do have a book more generally on the Black family. And she said, I reached out because I saw your conversation with Glenn Loury and I thought it was, interesting and introspective. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that. And obviously, thank you for writing the blurb for the book. So you have very much been an inspiration of mine. And I saw you, as you know, in the book, I talk about The Vanishing Family, the documentary from 1986, looking at the breakdown of the traditional Black family in Newark, New Jersey. And I note that you were part of that roundtable with Eleanor Holmes Norton and Jesse Jackson at the end of that documentary in 1986. So.
Moderated by Bill Moyers.
Yes, moderated by Bill Moyers.
1986, which is like 40 years ago.
Exactly.
I know it doesn't show, but I'm exactly that old. So I got to ask you this now. Come on, yes. You're Black, and you're at the Heritage Foundation. That's not a normal biography in political journalism these days. How'd that come to be?
It was a long and winding road. So I worked for 15 years in local government in DC prior to coming to the Heritage Foundation. But I've been writing about issues related to marriage and family probably for over 15 years. I first started writing for a website called Black and Married with Kids. I was the only single writer, and I wrote relationship articles. And from there, I opened up other opportunities. I wrote for the Root and for the Griot, and then for the Blaze and for the Federalist. So this is subject matter that I've been covering for a long time. And some of that writing and my emphasis on these issues opened up opportunities for me to go to Heritage once my term at DC was complete. And now I get to focus on family issues, generally speaking, addressing the decline in marriage, the increase in non-marital births, the increase in single-parent homes for all Americans. But the thing that most people don't understand is that Heritage, given its emphasis on the family, has been extremely supportive of my work focusing on the Black family. So contrary to popular opinion, this notion that this organization has something against Black people, well, that certainly wouldn't be the case if they are saying, no, we want the Black family to be as strong as possible in the same way that we want all families to be as strong as possible.
What do you mean by the Black family? Why not just the family? What's Black about it?
So this is a good question, and I address it in the book. One of the things that I note is that the left and the right seem like polar opposites when it comes to race and social issues, but they're actually just two sides of the same coin. So for the left, when they perceive that Black people are victims of some system or some structure, then they have no problem pointing to race. So I know, as you've covered before, they will racialize police shootings. So it's not a police officer shoots a citizen. It's a white cop shoots a Black suspect. The issue comes when, for the left, when it's time for Black people to take agency, then this is not, or if the issue is there are things that the Black community is not doing that we could be doing to better our circumstances, then they want to de-emphasize race and say, no, this is a problem that affects everyone. Conservatives are the opposite, oftentimes, where they are not interested in race-based solutions, but conservative influencers certainly have no problem saying that the issue is the decline of the Black family. The issue is not teen takeovers, it's teen takeovers by Black teenagers. So for me, I wanted to not necessarily, I didn't change my message, right? Because I have the same message. Every child has a right to the affection, protection, connection, correction, and direction of both mom and dad, the two people who create them, and that right is best exercised in a loving, low conflict household. But what I wanted to do is make sure that I addressed the letter to the people I was speaking to. So part of the emphasis on race is to say, this is the audience that I'm speaking to. The other part of it is just the prevalence of the issues we're dealing with, Glenn. And as you know, the non-marital birth rate for all American children, American families, is about 40%. For Black families, it's 70%. In Washington, D.C., where I work and where I've lived I've lived in this area almost 20 years, it's 77%. 77% of Black children in D.C. are born to unmarried parents, compared to 93% of white children born to married parents. That is a 70 percentage point gap. So for the people, particularly on the center left, who demand equity in every institution, I wrote this book because I wanted to ask them, well, why don't you apply that same framework to the institution of marriage? And you demand, again, racial equality in every structure. Well, why not when it comes to family structure? So part of it is the proximity. I'm talking about communities where I live. Part of it is the prevalence of the issue, and then part of it is to ensure that the mail and the letter gets delivered to the intended audience.
All right, and I want to talk about the book. I want to talk about feminism. I want to talk about welfare.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about leadership, about how we talk about these issues. And in that spirit, I'm reminded that I think the last time we were in the same room together was at Robert Woodson's funeral, the great Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center, formerly National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise. He represented a certain kind of leadership. I'm going to call it Black leadership, though I think his spirit and practice extended beyond the Black community as such. Do you think there's something to learn from the life and work of Robert Woodson that's relevant to the theme that you're taking up here about the Black family? And if so, what?
Absolutely. 1000%, Glenn. And actually meeting Bob, this is probably 5 years ago, and having that friendship and mentorship shaped me profoundly in terms of how I approach the book. I'll say it this way. I know we'll get into welfare. I read your essay from, I think, 2010 on First Things, addressing the Moynihan Report and the issues and commentary around the Black family stretching back 6 decades. One of the things that's different about this book than the Moynihan Report is that I'm actually writing to the Black leadership class. So anyone who reads the book will notice that I'm, in some parts, critical of Black leaders, and then in other parts saying, no, this is why you all need to do something. So I get that directly from Bob. It's the idea that the solutions to a community's problems are going to come from within the house, not outside of the house. And I think that strikes a lot of people as strange, particularly if they're on the center left, because many progressives, and I'm including Black progressives, don't say it this way, but they are dependency people. And Bob, yourself, myself, Ian Rowe, we are agency people. So when I say that there's enough moral, spiritual, social, cultural, political, and financial capital in the Black community to actually address this issue, that strikes people as strange, because they're oftentimes they're the type of people who only see solutions in one or two categories: bigger government and better white people. And I said that to you last time that we spoke on the podcast, right?
Yeah, we made a little thumbnail out of that.
Right, right.
You know, better white people is not a political program for Black people.
Exactly. You said it 3 years ago, and it still holds true today. So that strikes people as strange when they only see solutions coming in those two forms. So yes, I believe that there's enough capital within the Black community to actually address this issue and do what it is that I call for, which is to spark a family revival movement. The problem is the capital allocation strategy within Black America today is solely focused on politics. The only time Black leaders, particularly on the left, ask Black people, the people that they claim to speak to and for, the only time they ask us to do anything is when it is, I call this the BPV agenda. It's to boycott, protest, and vote. Those are the only three things. Any other disparity, any other issue that they find, they will say, we need new policies. The government needs to do something. This other external organization needs to do something. White people need to do something. So yes, I'm very much influenced by Bob's life and legacy. And in as much as I would have described myself as a Douglasonian and Washingtonian conservative, Booker T. Washington, now I will add also a Woodsonian conservative to that as well.
These other Black leaders that you're criticizing, the professors, the pundits, the performers, the preachers, and the politicians, they're going to say, oh man, he's at the Heritage Foundation. You know what they're about. That's Project 2025. They are in the pocket of the ultra-cultural conservatives and the capitalist class, and he's just a mouthpiece for reaction. And of course, they're going to entertain their favorite African-American voice that's spouting their rhetoric. But why should Black people listen to him?
And I would respond, because I would say, look, I'm saying that we actually can do something for ourselves. And one of the blessings of working at Heritage, and I've learned this over the last 4 years, especially as someone coming from local government, where almost every problem that you could think of, there was a government program or sometimes agency dedicated to, is that working in conservative circles, yes, that are critical of the size of the federal government, and where there's substantive debates about the size, structure, and scope of government more generally, is that conservatives put a heavy emphasis on the importance of civic institutions and other sort of pre-government institutions, the family being first and foremost. So for instance, I can use an example that's not related to the family directly, but I heard you speaking about this recently. You know, progressives will look at the 3 Black students recently admitted to Stuyvesant High School and say, we need new policies. We need to scrap the SHSAT, the Specialized High School Test. a test that I took, and I didn't make the cut, and I don't complain about it. By the way, I grew up in New York. Progressives will say we need new policies, we need more funding. Conservatives will say, as I've said, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Glenn, but I'll include you in this response. A conservative will say, no, what we need to do is to grow the pipeline of students who are eligible to take this test. And one of the ways we do that is not new legislation. It's to make a call to the National Society of Black Engineers, get the president on the phone, get the NSBE chapter, the closest chapter in New York City, as well as the graduate chapter, get them to call Glenn Loury and Roland Fryer and a few other people to say, can you advise us as we create a new math curriculum for out of school time activities that we can put in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, as well as the South Bronx? Progressives don't do that, again, because all of their solutions are about what people outside of the community are supposed to be doing. So as I said, they see me as a strange person because I'm saying, no, we can actually do something for ourselves.
Amen to that. But the but is going to be you're blaming the victim. You're putting the responsibility on the people who have the least resources and capacity. It's a social problem. It's a problem that has a history, a historical pedigree. It didn't fall from the sky. To the extent that you emphasize, I mean, I'm playing the devil's advocate and even voicing this argument that you emphasize self-help and personal responsibility, you are doing something that may be existentially necessary to live with dignity, but which is politically retrograde because it pushes away from the reform, restructuring, revision that is the politically correct thing to do in this situation. Again, you're at the Heritage Foundation. Of course, they're going to endorse self-help because it takes the onus off of the rest of the society, including the rich white folks.
And I could certainly see a number of progressives saying that, and I could think of some of the people right now. But one of the things that they don't understand about responsibility is that it is always attached to authority. So when you hand the responsibility for your community over to someone else, what you're saying is, I expect this person to exercise authority over me. Now, that doesn't make sense just as a human being. It especially doesn't make sense if you're the type of person that says, those people there are the ones oppressing me and creating the systems and the structures that keep my child from reading at a proper grade level. And yet I'm going to turn around and demand that they exercise more authority over my family and my community. So again, that type of framework does not make sense to me. And I would much rather say, no, we can do it ourselves. And honestly, Glenn, what's the point of having so-called Black institutions if we're not willing to mobilize the resources of said institutions and direct them back into the communities that people claim that they care for? If NSBE, I participated in NSBE when I was an undergrad, I was a computer engineering major. If NSBE, if the National NAACP, if the National Action Network, if the National Urban League, if the Congressional Black Caucus are not willing to actually do anything for Black people, then what is the point of them existing? If not just to say we need to mobilize the vote and fight for democracy and a bunch of other sort of empty platitudes. So I'm sure people will say that, and they will have that response, and they'll say he's from Heritage. Of course, he believes in self-help, but that should tell us how far we have fallen as a people, that we do not have the confidence in our ability to marshal our own resources to address the issues in our own community. I think that's a sad commentary on the state of Black America.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you about that too. Let's talk about the book.
Okay.
So, welfare and feminism have made marriage optional and children vulnerable. You want to unpack that?
Sure. So what I say, first, I want to sort of ground the book in a solid sort of historical context. So I opened the book in chapter 1 talking about the impact of slavery, of chattel slavery, on the development and dynamics within the Black family. And I draw two conclusions. One is that the institution of slavery and the institution of marriage are completely incompatible institutions, because marriage comes with a set of duties, obligations, expectations that cannot be fulfilled when one or both parties are owned by someone else. So the expectation that we will live together, under the same roof, the expectation that husband will provide for and protect his wife and children, the expectation of sexual exclusivity and monogamy. None of those things can be guaranteed if husband or wife or both are owned by someone else. But what I take away, my ultimate conclusion in chapter 1 is that the relationship between slavery and the Black family is really one of resistance and survival, because enslaved men and women were getting married under slavery, right? While enslaved, they were marrying, even though their marriages didn't have legal protection or oftentimes social recognition. And one of the first things they did when emancipation came was try to reconnect to loved ones in general, but oftentimes spouses. And what I argue is that slavery represented an external threat to the Black family. And generally speaking, with people, it's human nature that when you fight an external threat, or when you face an external threat, your response is naturally to fight. When I moved to chapters 2 and 3, chapter 2 on welfare, chapter 3 on feminism, I say what ended up happening over the course of decades was the development of 2 internal threats to the Black family. And they were internal because they came from people who passed themselves off as friends and allies of Black America. So in chapter 2, I argue that the rise of the welfare state, the rapid expansion of the welfare state from 1965, ending around 1996 with welfare reform, displaced men from their rightful position as providers in their home. Right? So government grew, basically said, if you're married, if a man and woman are married, can't have access to these benefits. And even if there's a man in the house for a period of time in the early part, of welfare sort of expansion, you also could not avail yourself of these resources. So welfare displaced men from their rightful position as providers and created incentives for women to not marry the father of their children if they wanted to get money, food, and shelter from the government. At the same time, so that's one shock, which disrupted the role of the man. At the same time, you have the rise of second wave feminism. Initially, and I write about Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and some of the early mainstream feminists. And then I talk about how Black feminism and or womanism developed as a distinct political ideology. And what feminism did, second wave feminism did, excuse me, it deceived women into believing that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic in men, but empowering in women, marriage is oppressive, the home is a prison, and children are a burden. That was the message, sometimes explicitly communicated, oftentimes implicitly expressed, whether in media, whether in academia, whether in film, music, culture. It pushed the idea that women don't need a man. Now, again, 1960s, dealing
like a
with
fish needs a bicycle.
Exactly. So again, that phrase is oftentimes attributed to Gloria Steinem, but the Black feminists who wrote early in the 1970s were making similar arguments, and for them, and I quoted Eleanor Holmes Norton, which is ironic, and I'll say why. She contributed to the Black Women's Manifesto, I believe that was published in 1970. And she said that Black women who are staying at home, reading stories to their children, right, homemakers, are not going to make it in the revolution. She believed that those women should be marshaling their skills and talents on behalf of the revolution against capitalism, racism, and also sexism. I say it's ironic because she said that in 1970. By 1985, either 85 or 86, she was writing an essay in New York Times Magazine titled, "It's Time to Restore the Traditional Black Family." And obviously,
I think that's what led Bill Moyers to invite her onto that panel that you
right. Okay, so this was probably 86. So in 15 years, she could see, okay, this ideology that I'm pushing is not beneficial to anyone in the household.
Well, you had to have been there, man. I was there in the 1960s and 70s, and it was a radical time, and a lot of conventional social and political arrangements were being questioned under the pressure of the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam movement and the rise of women's liberation movement. So, I mean, I might be willing to give Sister Eleanor Holmes Norton kind of a pass for in 1970 being an Alice Walker style feminist, but she came to her senses. No,
It eventually seems like she did, at least by 1986. But I would argue that was one generation after the beginning of the war on poverty, and you can see how quickly things began to change. So again, 1965 is often, mentioned when it regards to the Black family, because when the Moynihan report came out in 1965, about a quarter of Black children were born out of wedlock. So that means 3 and 4 were born to married parents. Even that rate was seen as cause for national concern by Moynihan and
well, it was sharply up from what it had been just a generation before.
Correct. By the time you get to 1986, and I mentioned this in the book, I believe in the intro, the non-marital birth rate for Black women was about 62%. So in one generation, right, it more than doubled. And part of what I argue in the book is that it takes a great amount of force. It takes, and I'm thinking of chemistry when you want to disrupt molecules within a particular cell. Like it takes some energy to do that. And in order to move something from the margins to the mainstream, there's a similar dynamic at play. In the 1960s and certainly before that, having children outside of marriage was something on the margins. But when you send the signal through the government that men are not ultimately responsible for the children that they create, and then you send another signal through oftentimes academia that women are better off without men and oftentimes without marriage and without children, then you end up creating an environment where a new type of family formation culture takes place. And that environment, and I'll sort of reach for a biblical example, when the Bible talks about everything reproduces after its own kind. And what I'm saying is, once that norm takes hold in a particular community, the norm where marriage is obsolete and fathers are optional, you don't have to have the affirmative push from either of those two shocks anymore. The norm will reproduce after its kind. So now you can go to neighborhoods, Glenn, on the south side of Chicago, on the north side of Philly, in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, or West Baltimore, where you would struggle to find a single child being raised by a married mother and father. And in those neighborhoods, there are going to be churches who, if they are performing a ceremony for a 24-year-old male on a Saturday afternoon, it is far more likely to be a funeral than it is a wedding. And that new family formation culture, I argue in the book, started in the mid-1960s.
You know Orlando Patterson's work on slavery, the book Slavery and Social Death. Excuse me, Slavery and Social Death. And he has a collection of essays, Rituals of Blood, in which he returns to this theme. He says that the writers like Herbert Gutman, Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, which is a book I imagine you're familiar with, underestimate the deleterious consequences of slavery for the dynamic of family relations, a male-female interaction within Black America. Patterson gives as a definition of slavery, and I quote, "the permanent, violent domination of natively alienated and generally dishonored persons." This is his definition in that great book. Natively alienated means that the master's property claim intercedes between the familial dynamic of male-female, husband-wife, parent-child connection, because the master basically has control over the intimate personal relations of his property, including their offspring. And he says you can't have that and not have it have profound disruptive consequences. And Patterson, looking around the African diaspora, says you see these dynamics going on in the Caribbean, you see them going on in other the UK and European immigrant communities of African origin and so forth and so on. So I'm asking this question in the context of your emphasis on welfare, which is a latter-day development. It's true that the incentives are such as you described, but their ability to shape deep cultural undercurrents might be questioned. And to say that maybe it's a little optimistic to think that jumping the broom, and going to the Freedmen's Bureau to try to find my partner from whom I'm separated, which many Black formerly enslaved persons did, doesn't negate the damage that was done. And that's one kind of question I want to put in front of you. And another, just to finish the thought, where are the men here? Where is the culture of male responsibility, which is not determined by feminism and is not determined by welfare? Don't we need a theory of the men in order to get our minds fully around this phenomenon?
Absolutely. And I'll answer the second question first. We definitely need male leadership, first and foremost in the home. And secondly, in the movement to restore marriage as the foundation of Black family life. I think back to that 1986 documentary, The Vanishing Family, Crisis in Black America. And I'm thinking of one of the men who basically said, look, man, I've got, some kids and not my responsibility, and the government will take care of them. And that type of thing speaks to a level of irresponsibility that has to be addressed. Now, some people may say, well, struggling job prospects, unemployment, but the idea that a man who is struggling would sire multiple children, oftentimes with multiple women, but say, so it's like, oh, I'm unemployed, I can make babies, but I can't marry the mothers beforehand. This speaks to this idea of marriageability in some of these low income communities. And I do think a big part of it is the distorted dynamics between Black men and Black women. And this is one area where I actually am slightly critical of Moynihan, because in his report, he says something to the effect of, there's no reason that families that are basically led by fathers would be necessarily superior to those led by mothers. The only issue is when the dominant society has a more patriarchal family structure and one minority group has a matriarchal family structure. The problem is that the minority group is out of step with the majority. And I actually think that is the wrong way to look at this. And that type of thinking, that it wasn't the dynamics that was the problem, it was the fact that our dynamics were out of step with the dominant white society dynamics, is part of how you get later activists, and I'm thinking of BLM, for instance, that described the nuclear family, which they said that they wanted to disrupt, as a Western prescribed family structure, right? That's how you get progressive activists saying, well, this is just something that we picked up from white folks. And what I argue, and this is where my Christian worldview comes into play. What I argue is that men and women are created equal in dignity and worth, but different in form and function. All of us, again, equal in dignity and worth, made in God's image, but we have different roles to play in society, in the home, and that what I call androgynous egalitarianism. So the idea that there aren't really men and women, that those categories are just arbitrary, those arbitrary gender categories, and that men and women don't have different roles, again, within society and within family, is one of the reasons that even today we have such a difficult time talking about what it takes to repair familial bonds. Because since the beginning of time, men have always had the same role, Glenn. Bare minimum. You have to provide, you have to protect. Bare minimum to be considered a halfway decent man. The question comes in, and again, this goes back to the second wave feminism, and this is not a critique of women per se, but of feminist ideology. The question comes in when you say, okay, well, what role do women have in the family and in the home? And that's the question people are a lot less interested in answering. So I do think a lot of this is about righting the relationship between men and women. It's about men taking their rightful position in the family, which means leading and loving their wives and loving their children. And it's about men and women sort of interacting in such a way where they can build the types of bonds that make for a safe and secure place for children to be raised.
You want to turn back the clock to the 1950s, Brother Squires?
That's what they'll say.
We ain't going, says the feminist or womanist. We ain't going back to the 1950s. You want to tie us down. You want us pregnant, fat, and barefoot and happy. You want to take away our possibility of realizing our ambitions for meaningful and remunerative work. You go to hell, man. I got my liberation and I'm going to keep my liberation. What do you say to these women who are, black or otherwise, going to object strenuously to a biblically grounded lecture about what their role in life is when they see it really quite differently?
Well, I will start with an observed reality about life and love, which is that very, very few people, and in my life, I've probably no more than 5, can live an entire lifetime without long-term, deep romantic relationships and or a desire for children and still live a contented life. So most people want someone. And even most of the women who will object and say what it is that you said want someone. Now, I opened chapter 3 in the book talking about a woman named Ebony K. Williams. She's a public figure, journalist, media personality. And a few years ago, she was on The Griot, which is a media platform, African-American audience. And she was basically saying that for women like her, upwardly mobile, highly educated, professional, economically secure, that women like her are tired of relationships that don't serve them, but oftentimes want to pass on everything that they've accomplished and accumulated to children. So she's basically saying, I'm ditching the push for a husband, and I'm going to do what is required for me to just have the baby. So yes to the baby, not so much to the husband. And in a 3-minute video, Glenn, she directed Black women like herself to invest and even stock up on Black sperm. These were her words, Glenn. Black sperm. Yes, she used the term Black sperm 6 times in a 3-minute video. So completely detaching the man's reproductive capacity from him and his capacity as a husband and or father. All right. So she's exactly the type of person you're talking about. Probably in the 1%, probably makes more money than most of the men she would come across. And her push to her sister, and she said, if you have a vial yourself, you should gift one to your girlfriends or your sister or your sorority sisters. And I'm saying, like, this is the fruit of feminism. It is probably the first time in recorded history where you have a critical mass of women saying, I don't need a man. There's no parallel on the other side where men say, well, I don't need a woman. I know I need my wife. I know that. So
don't get me started, Delano.
Right. But this is the reality that we live in. So, and I connect this to history. They talk about going back to the 1950s. Glenn, I think about all of the domestics in the Deep South, the sanitation workers, the Pullman porters, the sharecroppers, the people who work their hands to the bone to provide for future generations and to scrimp and save to send them off to colleges, where then their children and grandchildren and sometimes great-grandchildren will be inundated with values that are counter to the values of the people who got them there. And this is why we have some of these issues where, again, you send your daughter off to college and you tell her a man is not a plan. A man will always be there. Focus on your studies. Focus on this. And then when she's in her mid to late 30s and then complaining like, I want to be married, but I can't find a suitable mate. Now she's expressing the frustration based on what she was taught from her mother, grandmother, and aunts. I think there's something better for us as a community. So I don't buy their worldview. The last thing I'll say is this, and just to put a fine point on this,
Okay.
we're also having two separate conversations using the same terms, because I'm most concerned about the disappearance of marriage in sort of inner city, low income, working class communities. That the family formation dynamics in those places are not dictated by what goes on at Hampton University or Howard University or the cocktail parties on Martha's Vineyard, right? The college educated issue is a slightly different issue, which oftentimes is about the gender imbalance on college campuses, and then in the workforce, and particularly Black women finding it difficult to find mates with whom they share values and life experiences. I'm most concerned, Glenn, about the fact that in Baltimore today, in Baltimore, Maryland, that 83% of Black children are born to unmarried parents, 77% in Washington, D.C., and I believe 85% in St. Louis. So I'm concerned about the places where marriage has completely disappeared, and where the marriage culture and family structure that was the norm from the end of the Civil War through the end of the Civil Rights Movement is vanishing and on the verge of extinction.
Okay, devil's advocate is back.
Okay.
Marriage is neither necessary nor sufficient for responsible parenting. You can have responsible parenting without the parents being married, and that's a legal construct. Or you can have marriage without the parents being responsible to the developmental needs of their children. I can cite many examples, so goes the devil, of fathers who were not husbands, but who were nevertheless a formative presence in the life of their children. And I can cite many examples of husbands who were not fathers, who were distracted by philandering or by their obsession with work or money and whatnot, and didn't hear a word their kid was saying.
Yeah.
What's special about marriage?
Well, I would argue that marriage is the greatest structural enabler of father involvement, because when a man stands before his friends, family, and his God, and commits to a woman for life, that is a different type of relationship than just saying, "Well, that's my girlfriend. We mess around. We're not sure what we're doing." Situationship, whatever terms that young people use today. So marriage really is a different type of relationship. And again, particularly in Christian circles, you'll hear the terms, a covenant relationship, not just a short-term business contract. So I would argue that marriage as an institution is fundamentally different than any other relational arrangement between men and women. There's a reason that, for instance, the vows to stay together in sickness and in health till death do us part do not show up in any divorce decree or cohabitation agreement that I've ever heard of, right? Because it's just a different relationship. And sure, are there examples of people who've been great fathers and not husbands, and poor fathers while being married? Absolutely. But I'm thinking of cultural renewal targeted sort of, again, in the mainstream and not at the margins. There are also examples of people who have dropped out of college or high school and become millionaires. But we wouldn't make policy around that, and we certainly wouldn't shape cultural norms around that. So I think the design of the marital union and what it is intended to produce, particularly creating the greatest opportunity for, the greatest environment for raising children, is why I'm putting the emphasis on putting marriage back before carriage. Because when mom and dad live in separate places, that has consequences. One, for dad, if he's basic, bare minimum, he's providing for his household. If he has, let's say, 3 children by 2 different women, and he doesn't live with any of his kids, his check is being split at least 3 ways. So every dollar that he gets has to go out in 3 different directions. And he's not going to be able to give the same type of attention to all of his children, particularly if he doesn't live with them. And in fact, if he takes up with another woman and she has her own children, he may end up being closer to her children than his own because of the impact of his presence under the same roof on a day-to-day basis. So to me, anyone who is dismissing or diminishing the importance of marriage, I think is speaking from a place that goes against both the design. So they're speaking against the data, design, nature, and for those who care, I would also say scripture, because Glenn, every entity, anything that's created operates best when it is used according to a manufacturer's design. So in the same way, for instance, I'll use a non-marriage related example. I can drive a car from New York to Los Angeles on a spare tire, but no one in their right mind would argue that manufacturers should start designing vehicles with 3 factory grade tires and 1 spare, and still think that you're going to get the same performance at scale across an entire country of 330 plus million people. That's the same way I feel about people who diminish the importance of marriage by pointing to a few examples of how things can be done, with these different types of arrangements.
A few examples. I think you're going to have more than a few, but okay. Let me ask you this. Are you in favor of gay marriage?
No.
I mean, if marriage is such a good thing, and if, I don't know what, 10% of the population or whatever number it is, are same-sex oriented, then shouldn't we be favoring them forming families, marrying, and raising kids that they'd have to adopt or use IVF or something like that?
This is a good question, and I mean, my simple answer is no. We should not be in favor of that, but I'll explain why. A few things I can point to the data. I speak to this in the book. An extremely, I think it's probably less than 1% of particularly Black children are raised in families with same-sex parents. So you're talking about something that is
okay. It's a real fringe thing.
Correct. But the bigger issue is this: every single human being is the living embodiment of the relationship between one man and one woman. So there's only one set of relational arrangements between men and women that produce offspring. And what I argue in the book, when I get to the second half of the book where I'm talking about solutions, is that conversations about marriage, whether in the family, in the policy space, or in the culture space, right? Family conversations always revolve around the desires of adults. And we need to change that to make them revolve around the needs and rights of children. And I said it quickly earlier in our conversation, but I'll slow it down here, which is to say, every child has a right to the affection, protection, connection, correction, and direction of the one man and one woman who created him or her. And that right is best exercised in a loving, low conflict home with a married mom and dad. And as you know, rights always come with corresponding obligations. So the one man and one woman that created the one child have an obligation to care for that child. Me, let's say I was still single at my age with no children. I don't have a right to a child that I have not created. Because if I said I had that right, then that means that someone is either obligated to give me their reproductive capacity and or material, or someone is obligated to give me a child that somebody else created. So no, I don't think that those rights claims are grounded in any sort of moral framework. They're grounded in a framework where people say, well, whatever adults want, we should give them. They should have the family of their dreams. But I would argue, no, a child has a right to the parents who created them. And that's why I think getting rights right and getting the framing right in terms of what it is that I'm fighting for, which is not, improving the dating prospects of adults. It's about improving the life outcomes of children, is the part of the reason that I take the position that I take.
Okay, I could argue with that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to ask a social scientist question before opening things up, because we have apparently a queue of people in the comments who are eager to have you respond to their queries. But the social scientist question is this: is marriage cause or is it effect? And let me just explain what I mean by that. There are beneficial consequences for child outcomes of their parents being married. Let me stipulate that. The data show that. Melissa Kearney is only the latest in a long line of social scientists who've addressed themselves in data analysis to this issue. The success formula, the success sequence of, finish school, marry, and then have kids, get a job, and then have kids is premised on this kind of social science research. But the question is, if I take two people at random and if I were running an experiment, had them either marry or not marry, whether the fact of marriage in and of itself would lead to better outcomes for their children, or whether what's really going on is that people differ with respect to their extent of embracing their responsibilities, their effectiveness in responsibly conducting their lives and so forth. Some people are just better at life than other people. Those people who are better at life both tend to marry because they are prepared to make a commitment and to live by it, and also turn out to be more effective parents. But it's not the fact of marriage. I went to the county office, I got the certificate, I went before the preacher, we said I do. It is the character of the people involved that is the leading both to their being married and to their children having better outcomes, not the fact of marriage in and of itself. What would you say to that? Because if you could force people to marry, if you could somehow in an imaginary world compel marriage, do you really think it would make a difference in the Black community for the child outcomes and so forth and so on? Because it wouldn't change the people.
I would argue that marriage actually does change people.
Okay.
Some for worse, oftentimes for better. I think when a man and woman come together within a marital union, oftentimes they help moderate some of the, even for lack of argument, for the sake of argument, some of the worst impulses, right, in the opposite sex. So for men, it may, having a wife makes you a little more risk averse. You'll say, look, I would love to be a 30-year-old guy and ride, my crotch rocket down the highway at 100 miles an hour, but I have a wife and kids at home, so I'm not going to do that, right? And oftentimes for women, having a husband, again, particularly if you're the type of woman who's prone to anxiety or fear, having a stable and steady force in the household that says, no, we're going to make it through this period in our life, actually does change you as a person. But I would say, getting to the issue of child outcomes, I've heard this argument, and I think it is an attractive argument, particularly in an era where we live, where marriage is increasingly becoming a luxury good. So concentrated among the educated, middle class, affluent.
Not just Blacks. That's the
correct
rule.
For anyone across the board. But if you roll the clock back again 60 years, marriage was basically a universal part of the American life script. And the life script across the globe, Western countries, Eastern countries, you grew up, particularly in America, you grew up, you finish high school, you might get some college, start a job at the plant or in the military. And by 24 years old, and median age of first marriage, even in 1980, was about 24 for a man, 22 for a woman. Today it's 31 and 29 respectively. There's no reason to expect we won't get to where it is in some European countries. In Spain, for instance, it's 37 and 35. So the life script has changed. And back again 60 years ago, as I said before, the domestic was married, the sharecropper was married, the home heating oil salesman was married. This was just a general part of the life script as people move from adolescence to adulthood. So yes, I would say that marriage is a major factor when it comes to improving child outcomes. And the only way you can diminish, or one of the ways you get to diminish that, is if you either explicitly or implicitly believe that fathers do not matter when it comes to child outcomes. Because 90% of children raised by a single parent are raised by a single mom. So most kids raised by one parent live with their mother. So anyone, and I'm thinking, of Harvard sociology professor Christina Cross, who wrote this book, Inherited Inequality. that called family structure the great distractor. And she argued that while two-parent families, kids in two-parent families have better outcomes than kids in single-parent families, the two-parent family structure does not benefit Black children as much as white children because racial gaps exist in outcomes still between, Black kids raised by two parents.
That's
and white
fallacious.
kids
That's statistically fallacious inference.
right. So this is her argument. But Glenn, the only way you can get there is if you want to diminish the role and importance of fathers. And I would never do that, not just because I'm a dad myself, but because I believe that children get something unique from their father. I don't believe in genderless, androgynous parenting, mother's mother and father's father, right? So when you see a parent tossing a 6-month-old child 2 feet into the air,
it better be the dad.
It's going to be the dad. So people may not see that as important, but dads tend to teach their kids about risk taking. They tend to help them hone their gross motor skills, talk to them in whole words. And there's a certain sense of safety and security and comfort that children get, when they have a father. And even the people who may push back on this, one, if they have children, it's almost guaranteed that they have them within the context of marriage, right? The Who's Your Daddy DNA truck does not drive around Martha's Vineyard, the Hamptons, or Napa Valley. I can tell you that much, right? And two, these types of people would not promote sort of the marriage obsolete lifestyle to their own children. And that is one of the things that frustrates me about the Black leadership class. And I have an entire chapter called Taking Them to Task. These people live right, but talk left. So they live and embody the values I talk about in the book, but they either defend or encourage a completely different set of values to their less fortunate brethren. So no, if you believe that fathers matter, then you have to believe that families and marriage matter as well.
Okay, and you're not the first person to observe this disparity between life practice on the one hand and ideological rhetoric on the other in the leadership classes, not just the Black leadership class.
Agreed.
But we have the advantage, Delano, of a live interaction with our audience during this broadcast, and you provoked, apparently, some responses. I'd like to Mark Sussman to come back into the picture. Okay. He's a curator of comments and questions, and he's going to put you on the hot seat, man.
Okay. Well, first I'll say that the conversation in the YouTube chat is flying fast and furious. I cannot keep up with it. But there is a debate, several debates going on at once. Some of them meet the qualifications for debate, I think. So here's a few questions that I was able to pull. I'll save that one. Let's see. Well, they're mostly comments. So this is from James Murphy 5315 from YouTube. He says the largest forcing function to drive families and people together is to only provide cash as welfare with a time limited to 5 years. People would discover ways to cooperate and bring people together, is what he says. So he's got a little bit of a policy proposal for you.
No, I mean, 60 years of social history and progressive policy, I think, have proven that more welfare is not going to lead to more marriage and more family. Because, and part of the argument that I make in the second half of the book, and the second half of the book is all solutions, is about the essence of marriage culture. And when you live in a neighborhood where no one gets married and no one tells you that you should get married, then you have no reason to think that, even if sort of, welfare is time limited or funds are reduced. So I don't see why that person would believe that's the case. Now, I would respond with a different policy prescription. And this is one, I don't think it made it into the book, but this is a play that I'm beginning to run now because I want to use the book as a blueprint. I recently sent the DC City Council a model bill to create a commission on racial equity in family structures. So Glenn, where we started in the beginning, where I said 77% of Black kids in DC are born to unmarried parents. 93% of white kids are born to married parents. That is a 70 percentage point gap. And I'm saying the city that has an office on racial equity and demands equity in every system and structure should apply that same framework to family structure. So what this commission would do would actually study the connection between family structure and social outcomes. It would recommend certain policy prescriptions. Those could be simple things like public awareness campaigns. Those could be things like, funding for, marriage boot camps for cohabiting couples with children. But it would provide an evidence base as to why, one, that this gap exists and why it matters, and why the city should be invested, not exclusively, because there's a role for not just the state house, but also the church house and the schoolhouse and the art house, by the way, but why the city should be invested in trying to close this equity gap, this racial equity gap, in the same way that they are in closing others.
Let me interject something here. It's about welfare, Medicaid, supplemental nutrition programs, school lunches, family income assistance to indigent families, housing, Section 8. You're going to get rid of all of that? I mean, when you say welfare, are you, welfare is the culprit here. Do you envision a world in which the state would offer no programmatic economic support to indigent families? And how do you think those families are going to get by in such a world?
No, I'm not arguing that. And the welfare angle of the book is used to explain how we got the current family formation culture that dominates.
Understood.
Right. So
but I'm talking about going forward.
Right. Going forward, my hope is to change the demand for marriage, right? Not change the supply of welfare. Because again, in my positive vision for the future, and I know that this will not be everyone, but when a man and a woman commit to one another, he's going to say, we don't need Uncle Sam to take care of our family. Now, we may be eligible for instance, a child care subsidy. I see that as a different government assistance of a different type than public housing, than direct cash assistance. And in fact, I start chapter 2 in the book talking about a DC program called Strong Families, Strong Futures that gave women $10,800 either as a lump sum or a monthly payment. And the first mom, who they described as a stay-at-home mom of 3. Now, when I hear stay-at-home mom, I'm thinking, okay, a husband is somewhere making things happen. It said she had a subsidized 2-bedroom apartment, WIC, SNAP, TANF, and now at this, she was participating in this program. And what struck me most, Glenn, was that in that write-up from the Washington Post, the word father was only used 2 times. One, when it said that the father of her 3 children went along with them on a $6,000 luxury trip to Florida, and another where a woman said that the fathers of her children are not really involved in their life. So to me, I want to address the marriage culture upstream. Not my goal is not to say we need to zero out welfare funding, because some of the women that I would be talking to, and some of the women that the Post had in this particular paper, in this write-up, weren't even on welfare outside of this program. They were social workers. One was a letter carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. So this family formation culture where marriage has become obsolete and fathers are optional, exists outside of just the lowest income indigent welfare moms.
Okay. Let's take another question or comment from the listening audience.
Okay, I'm just going to run through a few of these comments because, well, you'll see. So one is from Mary, who just says, "Whoa, you don't believe in gay marriage? Oh wow, that's Mary."
Can I respond to Mary?
Go
quickly?
ahead. Yeah, please.
I'll say this: there are a lot of people who would say this guy's a Christian conservative. He wants to impose his views on everybody else. And what I'll say to them is this: when the federal government and when the Supreme Court decided to change the legal definition of marriage for all 50 states, a lot of progressives cheered that as a sign of progress. Those same progressives are going to have to ask themselves why their preferred definition of marriage, which today is basically 2 consenting adults, should stay in place in perpetuity. Because if anyone is like me and you read the New York Times, even today, the New York Times has a piece on whether polyamory is right for people. So the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic write these pieces on a regular basis. And when 3 men walk into a courthouse in New York City or San Francisco and demand to have their polyamorous relationship recognized, then progressives are going to have to ask on what basis their current definition should be held in the ground and not changed. And once the doors are open, then it's, if not 3, why not 4? Why not 165? So everyone has a line that they draw and a basis on which.
Delano, but with great respect, I don't think that's a particularly cogent argument. It's a saying, we can't make any deviation because every deviation after the one that we made is the door is open to it if we make any deviation. And a person could argue that very cogently that polyandry is not appropriate and still support the idea that gay people should be able to find comfort in the institution of marriage with the people that they love.
I don't see how would a person.
Are you saying it's a slippery slope? Are you saying once we depart from, let me just say, the biblical conception of man and woman and so on, all bets are off? I don't see that. I don't see that all bets are off follows from the fact of departing.
Oh, I actually see the complete opposite. I mean, again, Glenn, these things always start in the culture first and work their way through the political system later. And I don't think there's any coincidence that polyamory is all the rage in the cultural institutions that shape both policy and social norms. So what I'm saying, sure, you can consider it a slippery slope argument. What I'm actually speaking to progressives who would challenge my desire to hold fast to a particular definition of marriage. And I'm saying that they're going to have their particular definition of marriage challenged in the near future. And they will have to have some basis on which to keep that definition.
Okay, understood. Let's move on to another question or comment, Murray.
Okay. Well, let me just offer you an antidote to the tone implied by the last one. This is from Eartha Dikit Who on YouTube, who says, oh, sorry, it's from Eartha Dikit, who says, who is this incredible man? So there you go.
Thank you, Eartha.
You met him here first, Eartha.
This is a comment from Robert Red, a mainstay over at the Substack, who says, despite the decrease in marriage, Black poverty has decreased. Blacks are the second largest ethnic group of millionaires. Black female entrepreneurs created a fund to aid Black female entrepreneurs. It was challenged by a conservative. So he's making the case that
what's the point?
There is no real question, but I think the point is something like that the situation for Black Americans is not as dire as one might think if they took on board only the critique that is being offered here today.
So out of wedlock births is up, but African American general economic condition is also up.
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, if you look at the data, the Black poverty rate in the 1960s was around 40%. The irony is that as Black
and it's
Americans,
significantly lower than that now, no?
Correct. It's about 17, 18%. So it's under 20. But the irony is that as Black Americans gained economic power, more education, political representation, more cultural status, that families began to break apart. So, you know, it almost looks like a scissors if you look at the graphs. And actually, I call this the poverty paradox in the book, where because people will say, well, the issue of the increase in non-marital births is poverty. And I said, actually, it has been going up as every indicator in terms of, upward mobility in Black America has improved. But I think what this person is, they are making a slightly different argument than I'm making, right? I'm not saying Black America as a whole is, in dire straits per se. I'm saying that the disappearance of marriage, particularly in low income and working class communities, is going to have significant cultural and political impacts that we have to address right now. It would be easy for me, someone who lives in the suburbs, to say that's not my problem. But what I'm saying is, if you care about so-called teen takeovers in the inner city, if you care about disproportionate Black male incarceration, if you care about the achievement gap in schools, if you care about sort of the general health and wellness and well-being of children, then you have to care about family structure. So that's my argument. And I don't. The success of the Black middle class is oftentimes used as a cover to ignore this problem, and I don't think we should continue doing that for another 60 years.
Okay, Mark, what's next?
Okay, so this is a comment, but I'm going to tack a question onto it to kind of make the point. Hex 5106 from YouTube says, it sucks that Delano has to take up with the conservatives because the idiots at places like Brookings are also bigoted in their own way. Fixing families should not be partisan or racial. Now, I think one of the questions one could ask is, have you worked, you explicitly identify as conservative. Have you tried reaching out or working with people who don't share that particular political orientation? Or are you finding...
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, absolutely. I say in the book, the reason I speak so much about the Black leadership class, the progressive, politicians, pundits, preachers, professors, and performers, the people I call the Afrostocracy, is because within sort of the Black political ecosystem, 98% of the action, 98% of the institutions, the leaders are on the center left. So in order for something to move, in order for the cultural agenda in Black America to move, those are the people that have to be convinced. So yes, I absolutely agree. One, that this should not be a partisan issue. I go to great lengths to credit President Obama, Barack Obama, both as candidate and as president, of being, at least in my lifetime, the politician who most consistently makes a link between family structure and social outcomes. And he did it oftentimes to his own detriment because he would get smacked on the hand by his Black progressive left flank. He did it in 2008 when he took men to task on the South Side of Chicago during a Father's Day speech at a Black church. He did it when he spoke to the young men at Morehouse and talked about them becoming husbands and fathers. He did it in his second term when he, on the South Side of Chicago, a week after his second inauguration, when he said, if we want middle-class communities with low crime, we have to do more to encourage marriage and responsible fatherhood. So I'm not a partisan when it comes to this issue. And in fact, I wrote a piece for the Institute of Family Studies, the Institute of Family Studies, titled "The Conservative Case for More Pro-Marriage Democrats." So yes, I want to work with people across the aisle. I have reached out to the most prominent Black media, institutions. I've pitched articles and op-eds to Essence Magazine, to Vibe Magazine. I reached out again to, those big voices and those big platforms.
What kind of responses have you gotten?
No response to this point. I don't want to read too much into that. I know people are busy. They get a lot of emails. Some may be resistant to talk to someone from Heritage Foundation. But I am all for making, outreach across the aisle, and actually am willing to lay down my arms on a lot of other political issues if we can just get people together to focus on this issue. So no, I don't want this to be partisan. Part of the problem is that the more conservatives, generally speaking, not just Black conservatives, the more conservatives focus on marriage and family structure, which we do on our side, so to speak, the easier it is for people on the left to say, no, that's just a conservative hobby horse. That's an obsession. They just want to take women back. And it's easier for them to draw back and ignore the issue. But no, I'm all for reaching across the aisle. And if this bill in DC goes forward and this commission is created, I would want to run that same play in blue cities all across the country.
I have a thought. My thought is the politics of the Democratic Party is the elephant in the room here. Mm-hmm. That it's a coalition. Coalition consists of different elements that are to some degree at odds with what might be necessary for the social health of the low-income African-American community. And the politics very heavily depend upon people who will go ballistic if you come out as a congressman or a governor or a cable news host or a podcaster and start extolling the Heritage Foundation's social cultural philosophy and using Black people as the vehicle for that. And in order to stay in good graces, the governor of Pennsylvania, Shapiro, who may run for president, the governor of California, Newsom, who may run, the governor of Illinois, Pritzker, who may run for president, whatnot, will not be caught dead saying exactly what you want them to say. And African Americans don't want to be called Bill Cosby. They don't want to be. They don't want to be ostracized and pushed to the margins of the discussion about what's good for Black men, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a kind of closure on the range of discourse that's acceptable. And I wonder if you A, agree with that, and B, what you think can be done about it.
I do agree with that. I think your analysis is spot on, Glenn. I think one of the things that needs to be done, and I'm going to write about this more in a forthcoming essay that I'll probably call The Death of Black Politics. One of the things that needs to be done is for more institutions to be created by Black conservatives that are outside of the political framework. Because right now, 90% of the energy for sort of your average Black conservative influencer is on getting a different set of politicians, elected. And what I would say is that 71% of Black voters identify as either moderate or conservative. So there are a lot of people who agree with the things that I say in the book, right?
Right.
So it might not be the National Urban League who wants to talk to me, but it may be a local Urban League affiliate that's running a Black fatherhood program. And they say, look, this guy at Heritage, well, we disagree with Heritage on a bunch of stuff. He's for the Black family. He's for Black fathers. I'm for Black fathers. Let's talk to see if we can do some work. It's another reason, Glenn, that I'm trying to reach out to HBCUs, because I believe that as institutions, they have a tremendous amount of influence. I think this is an area where far more research needs to be done to assess attitudes around relationships, marriage, children, family formation, particularly in the Black community. So it's a huge gap in the research. And I think HBCU should fill that gap. And in fact, I have pitched a proposal for an HBCU marriage and family consortium to representatives from at least 3 different schools.
Wow. Have you thought about the fraternal and sororal organizations?
Those are on the list. On the list
the
as
links,
well. The links, Eastern Star, every major institution in Black America, Jack and Jill, all of those institutions I think need to be mobilized, because and the beauty of this, Glenn, is that I know this is possible, because when it comes to electoral politics, this is exactly what happens. The church is mobilized. It souls to the polls. All of the fraternities and sororities, the athletes, the entertainers, everybody is mobilized to help Democrats, if we're being honest, retake the White House. And I'm saying, Glenn, the same energy can be directed in rebuilding the Black family.
All right. Mark, you want to come back in?
Yeah, I got one more question, and this is my question, so I'm going to use my privilege here to ask it. So I want to go back to the gay marriage and family issue, and there is a population of children, of course, that don't have families, and those are orphans. Those are children whose parents either gave them up for adoption or, in some cases, were killed, and there's no one to raise them. So those kids don't have the option of having a mother and father, their birth mother and father raising them. Now, given that that's the kind of one of the primary reasons that you think that a mother and a father, a husband and wife is the best family formation, why would it not be acceptable to see an affluent gay couple who wants children, who cannot, between the two of them, make a child except from outside assistance, and who, as a matter of fact, do adopt at, for obvious reasons, higher rates than the straight population? What would be wrong about encouraging inclusion or encouraging adoption among them? A gay marriage is a fact. You can you have your arguments against it, but there are gay married couples out there, a lot of them. What's the objection to placing children in homes with people who will love them and who will take care of them? Yeah,
so that's a great question, and I answer it as someone who My wife was a social worker in DC for 5 years. We actually overlapped for 5 years while I worked in DC government. And this is an issue that the city, dealt with in a number of different cases, some high profile cases. My argument again goes back to the idea that children have a right, again, to their married biological parents. I will acknowledge that right is not always possible to be exercised because, as Mark said, sometimes parents are not around, neglectful, abusive. And then from there, I would ask myself, okay, who's in the best position to step up? My wife and I are adoptive parents. It's a kinship adoption for a child that we had never met prior to her coming to our home. So this is where, to me, families, fictive kin, should be stepping up to adopt children. Now, again, I get that the laws allow for same-sex adoptions right now. My primary argument is that no unrelated adult has a right to a child that is not theirs. So I'm using very specific language. People may believe it's good policy. People may say we'd rather a child, adopted by two men than to grow up in a group home. And they're free to make those arguments. I'm saying part of what I want to do is shift the conversation about rights to what children need and not what adults want. The other thing, and this is becoming far more prevalent because reproductive technology is far more expansive and ubiquitous than it was in previous generations, is now you see people, and not just gay men and women, sometimes, I talk about Ebony K. Williams, who intentionally create either motherless or fatherless children. And it's the same mindset. I want a child. I'm going to have the child or the family of my desire, regardless of what it is that the child will ultimately lose out on. And that's another thing that I'm not in favor of. And again, even if it's a straight man with millions of dollars, I'm not in favor of that. I'm not in favor of the Elon Musk approach to family formation, where a billionaire has 14 children by at least 4 different women. So this is not me targeting one particular type of lifestyle. This is me saying our entire conversation around family formation places too much emphasis on what the adults want and not enough emphasis on what the children need. So I'm not saying, people are going to, same-sex couples are going to have their children taken away. I'm saying the type of family reformation that I envision would have sort of internal mechanisms to deal with some of these issues, but only if we begin to do family in a particular way. And this is what I mean. We're going to come up on a generation of children, first a generation of adults, older adults, who either never will have or never will get to hold their grandchildren. We're coming up on a generation of families where children will have one or fewer first cousins. And part of it is because the family formation culture in America, generally speaking, has moved from early and often to less and later. People are marrying less, they're waiting longer in life to get married, and they're having fewer children. So one of the reasons that so many children end up vulnerable, one is because a lot of times men and women don't know how to pick appropriate partners, and kids are being brought into the world under extremely unfortunate circumstances. Now, this is not an argument for abortion, so I don't want anybody to hear me and think that that's what I'm saying. But it's also, we don't have the kind of thick familial kinship networks that we used to have when a child, let's say born in the 1950s, may have been, they have their mom and dad, and their mom and dad were one of 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 siblings, where you have a larger network of people who can care for a child if something goes wrong. Now we have situations where it's just like, well, it's mom and dad, best case, if even, and grandma, mom's mom is around, and that's about all the family help that we have. So I'm envisioning a radical shift in family formation and family development culture. And that starts first and foremost with the men and women who make decisions to come together and create children. Everything else is downstream from that.
I got to ask you this, Delano.
Mm-hmm.
What is so special about the sperm and the egg the kid does have a right. It has a right to life, pursuit of happiness, and all of that. You're asserting a right to nurture by the biological progenitors, and I want to know where that comes from.
Well, I would argue that creation always comes with an obligation towards stewardship. So there's no one who has a greater rights claim to, or the greater responsibility to care for a child than the people who made the child. Now, if I want to be tongue in cheek, I'll say, look, there's a million grandmothers out there who say, no, I actually love my grandbaby more than their parents, right? And maybe my mom might be in that list. But if I'm being serious for a second, no one has a greater responsibility to any given child than their parents. No one.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the infertile couple. You know, she can't produce the egg or he can't produce the sperm. They want to have a kid. So they make an arrangement in order to do that. It's, again, if I follow you, you seem to be saying that the kid has a right to be parented by the source of that biological material. And I just, again, want to know where that right comes from. Why are we privileging the sperm and the egg as opposed to the nature of the relationships between the people involved?
Because the sperm and the egg are the material that go to create the child.
I understand that. Why are we privileging that material when we talk about the child's right, a right to be raised by the source of the genetic material that made me? Where'd that come from?
Well, as I said, the child has a right because they have two parents. The parents have an obligation because they created the child. That is, to me, is an internally consistent argument.
Okay, in the hypothetical that I'm talking about, where they are not able to produce it on their own because they're gay or because one party or the other doesn't have the right thing, they arrange for the reproduction process to go forward, and in so doing, inherit the obligation to care for the consequences of that process. Not the source of the egg and the sperm, but the people who, in their relationship, have caused that child to come into existence. They didn't contribute the material, but they created the crucible in which the reproduction took place. And I'm just saying, what gives the special obligation to the biological source of the material that led the egg to be fertilized by the sperm, and not the people in whose relationship, in the context of whose relationship that process took place?
Well, obviously, if the people move forward with that process, right? Let's say you talk about a couple who has fertility issues, right? And that couple either does IVF or they have a surrogate, and the child is born and given to that couple. And obviously, the couple has that obligation, right? They have the child now. They have an obligation to that child. It would be the same if any other sort of arrangement. So again, Ebony K. Williams, I only talk about her because I mentioned her in the book. She created the child. She found a suitable donor, at least from her perspective. She has an obligation to care for the child. She wants, to my knowledge, nothing to do with the father. So once the children are here, obviously someone is obligated to care for them. I'm speaking to an ideal scenario, understanding that life obviously is not ideal. Now, I'm not speaking to a utopian scenario because utopia is a place that does not exist, but I am speaking to an ideal. And I think it's
where'd the ideal come from?
Well, Glenn, if for someone like me, I'd say scripture. For someone who doesn't believe scripture, I'd say nature, because it's children are only coming into the world in one way. Yes, we have scientific advances and reproductive technology that can address that, but even many same-sex couples still desire a biological bond to their child. It may be a bond from one parent or the other, but everyone has a desire. Let me not say everyone, but the people who desire children oftentimes have a desire for biological connectedness. So even they, in their argument, recognize that. And children have a desire to know where they come from, not just how I am in terms of my material conditions, but who I am and whose I am. So what I'm saying is that my framework, it internally consistently addresses the desires from both sets of parties. Now, again, I can make a religious, a scriptural, biblical argument, But for the sake of the audience, if there's like, Delano, I don't believe the God that you believe. Okay, that's fine, because it's possible to live in a home and not know the architect who designed it. Quite possible, and to enjoy its comforts and not know who designed it. But what I'm saying is their rights and their obligations, and nature dictates that this relationship between man and woman is the only way to produce offspring. And I'm saying we have policies, laws, cultural norms, customs that put sort of infrastructure in place to ensure that those obligations are being met and that those rights are being enjoyed. So that's how I would address that question.
Okay, I'm going to let you have the last word on that. But let's talk about the church.
Okay.
So you say scripture is the source of the authority, the moral authority for at least your approach to these issues.
Yes.
What is the role of the religious traditions that animate African American cultural life? In, you talked about the sorority, the HBCUs, the DC government. What about the church? What should they be doing? What should be preached from the pulpit? What institutional elaborations are developed in the church? What's the historical role, et cetera? How are you thinking about that?
So, Glenn, I read an entire chapter in the book, this chapter 5, on the Black church. And obviously, every Black church is not the same. And obviously, I'll state as a matter of theology that there's no such thing as, in Christian doctrine, as the Black church. More of a sociological descriptor, in the same way that somebody may say a white evangelical, right? But there's a history there, coming out of slavery, coming out of segregation. There's a history. There's certain denominations, right? Whether it's Kojic or AME or CME, Progressive Baptist, National Baptist. And what I argue in chapter 5, right, because I have a critique in chapter 5 and I come back into chapter 6 and talk about what I think should be done, is that progressive Black pastors over the last 60 years have distorted biblical truth for the appearance of social justice and political power.
Wow.
What I mean by that is
distorted biblical truth.
Correct. When it comes to marriage and family. So I opened that chapter talking about the fact that Barack Obama, when asked by Rick Warren in 2008 how he defines marriage, he said it's between a man and a woman, and God is in the mix. Now, it took Obama 4 years to evolve, quote unquote, on this issue, after his vice president got out ahead of him and said that he, believes in same-sex marriage. And then the president adjusted his views and says that he believes it's important for him to endorse and support same-sex marriage. What I write in the book is that it took a coalition of Black clergy members and civil rights organizations 1 week, Glenn, to evolve on their message. This was Sharpton, Reverend Joseph Loury, Julian Bond, that basically said, we don't want to let differences in doctrine and definition of marriage take away from larger goals around housing, healthcare, education, and economics. So this was the devil's bargain.
That was the bargain, but they might also have been thinking, the court is right. These people among us who are gay, and my son Glenn Jr. is one of them, have the right to bond together and have that recognized by the community, just like anybody else. Why should they be foreclosed from that? They could have been thinking that. I'm not asking you to agree with that. I know you don't agree with it, but I'm saying the imputation to these leaders that they're callow, superficial, fraudulent, cowardly is not the only interpretation. They might actually believe that the equal opportunity rights citizenship doctrine extends to gay people.
They might. The evidence for that would have been stronger if any of them had ever said that before Obama said it. So the idea that they only said it after he said it suggests to me that they were making a political point. The other thing is this: if a secular organization makes that point or makes that claim, I completely understand it. If the Human Rights Coalition makes that claim, I understand. If the ACLU, I understand it. But for Black preachers to be the ones saying, well, actually, right, I believe the God of the Bible, until it comes to, Genesis 2:24, where you see the first marriage take place, and, a husband and wife coming together, leave father and mother, cleave to one another for life. No, we actually think that God was sort of out of step with that. And what I do in the book is I walk readers through sort of the evolution of Black liberation theology, founded by Dr. James Cone, late 1960s, early 1970s. And Cone takes a completely different approach to understanding the Bible. For Cone, theology is a political tool, and white theology, as he called it, is the theology of the oppressor, and Black theology is the theology of oppressed. The problem, Glenn, is that since the 1960s, the category of oppressed has continued to grow at a fairly steady clip. So it wasn't just civil rights in terms of African Americans voting, segregation, political representation, so on and so forth. By the time Cone gets to his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, I want to say this is around 2011, he was comparing churches, including Black churches, that do not, in his words, affirm queer people, to white racists who lynched Black people. And when that is your biblical framework, you are unable to articulate biblical truth when it comes to the definition of marriage. Again, I'm making a theological argument now, not a political argument. And I think this is epitomized in the work of Senator Pastor Raphael Warnock, who pastors the same church that Dr. King pastored, in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta.
Just about to remark.
Right? And he says he comes out, affirms gay marriage, but not just that, because now the train has moved. Another car has been added on in the last 10 years, which is he affirms, he does posts for Trans Day of Remembrance and Trans Day of Recognition. So he can't even argue for the sex binary. So when I say that these pastors made a devil's bargain, I'm saying that the same men who open their Bible to argue against the color line have to close their Bible in order to argue against the sex binary. So that's why those preachers are going to be an obstacle to family reconstruction, because they don't even believe the book that they say that they preach from.
I have a theological question. I'm not a theologian, but I want to know the difference between how you think about the difference between the Old and New Testaments on these questions of family structure and morality and so forth and so on, about the ordination of women. What did Jesus have to say about homosexuality? Not that much, as I recall. So are we able to invoke a new covenant brought on by the ministry of Jesus Christ on behalf of some of the liberatory movements of feminist and gay rights and so forth that you seem to look askance at?
Well, you asked in terms of the relationship between the old and the new, and I would say they are, perfectly harmonious. So the old points forward to the coming of Christ the Messiah, and the new references backwards to the prophets of old. I would say when you get into, for instance, the book of Ephesians in chapter 5, where the marriage relationship between a husband and a wife is compared to the relationship between Christ and his church, not the Black church, just his church, sort of global capital C church, you're seeing that marriage has not only sort of a reproductive function, but also a representative spiritual function. So people may say, well, Jesus never talked about, he never condemned same-sex marriage or homosexuality, generally speaking. I mean, but he was operating within a framework where when people said marriage, everyone knew that required a man and a woman. In the same way, Glenn, that if I open up a vegan restaurant, I don't have to explicitly say that we don't serve meat here. It's baked into the definition of it being a vegan restaurant. So no, I don't think that you can twist sort of scripture to come up with theological support for either same-sex marriage or the denial of sort of male and female created in God's image. This goes back to Genesis, 1:28. So again, when I think about the role of the Black church, first and foremost, it has to get its teaching right. Now, the Black churches that I write about and the pastors I'm critical of in the book, Jamal Bryant, Howard John Wesley. I talk Otis Moss III. These are the type of men for whom the Black church, if not first and foremost, but significantly, they see the Black church as primarily a tool for political change and civic engagement. And yes, while the Black church has always had those aspects, even from its beginning, in previous generations, it was what churches should be, institutions of spiritual transformation and oftentimes moral formation. So when I get to chapter 6 and I'm saying what the church should be doing, it's pastors preaching that God's design for man, woman, marriage, and family, sex and sexuality are good. I'm talking about churches that preach the gospel, believe their Bible, and are willing to, on a practical level, either create or expand marriage ministries, family ministries, and use relationships, marriage, family as tools and opportunities for ministry. And in fact, Glenn, I was watching one of your recent shows and I sent you an email because you mentioned the First Baptist Church Glenarden, where Bob had, his
Bob Woodson's funeral was
correct,
at
Bob
that
Woodson's
church.
funeral.
A magnificent institution. That
Yes.
church.
So I live about 10 minutes from that church. The pastor of that church wrote a blurb for this book, and my wife and I took a post-marital class at that church called Home Builders.
John Jenkins.
Correct, John K. Jenkins. And I wrote a piece recently for the Washington Post where I mentioned Pastor Jenkins and how his church focuses on the importance of marriage and family and fathers. And then I also talked about another church in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Promised Land Church, led by Pastor Tommy E. Quick, who does the same thing. So I didn't want to just be critical of the types of progressive pastors I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I also wanted to give examples of how other ministers are doing this in their communities today.
Very good. We have a friend of the show, Robert Patton-Spruill, whom you met at the outset, Delano. He's lurking in the corridor, waiting to get in. So let's bring him onto the set and give him the opportunity to contribute to the conversation any way he sees fit. That's
absolutely
my man, Robert Patton-Spruill, who has a brilliant Substack that he's just got through starting, where he talks, among other things, about family, fatherhood, marriage, and so forth. Rob.
Hey, awesome conversation, guys.
Enough energy, man. Enough energy.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about me. So, so here's my first question to you guys. Again, the Black church. How is this going to help us in today's day and age? And for a little bit of context, I would like to bet that more people have actually been to movie theaters, this is for all Americans, in the last 2 weeks than have gone to a church service for anything. So how do you think the Black church has any actual sway in today's society? So are you looking at a solution from 1920 for us that went away in the 1960s? Is that what's going on? I mean, can you help me understand?
No, I still think the Black church is one of, if not the most important institution in many African-American communities. I'm talking about neighborhoods where there's a critical mass of Black folks, right? So whether you're in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Cleveland, Oakland, you're going to have a church there. Now, will it skew a little older? Likely. But that doesn't mean that there's not influence. Now, I know that churches are influential because this is where particularly Democrats pour a lot of their resources every 4 years, getting Black churches to get souls to the polls, to mobilize the Black church for political ends. And part of my frustration and what I would argue, Robert, is that the same churches need to do something similar as it relates to marriage and family. So I see the role, in this case, pastors playing the role of creating a marriage culture in their communities. So I don't see, again, I don't see why this can't happen. To me, you don't have to go back to the 1920s for this to happen. Yes, is religion down among all Americans? Yes, that is the case. It's also the case in Black America. That doesn't mean that pastors don't have a role to play and are not still respected as leaders in their institutions. The problem, as I said before, is that the capital allocation strategy among the Black leadership class, including the pastors, is completely focused on political change. And I'm just asking for a few pennies to be put into the bucket of family transformation. And I'll give you all a tangible example of this and an example of where I am in terms of my life in this particular issue. I recently spoke at the Social Conservative Policy Conference, SoCon in DC. I get to the hotel, Northwest Omni Shoreham Hotel, walk down, I'm looking for the signs. I see the sign to my left, but before I make the turn, I turn to my right and I see a big purple awning, a bunch of signs. It was the National Progressive Baptist Convention. This is a traditional Black denomination that started in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, being held directly across the hall from SoCon. And I said, this is my life in a nutshell. I want the Black church to talk about the family, but they don't. So I have to go and talk to white conservatives because those are the ones who are interested in talking about the family. And I think it's possible to find a subset of those progressive, Black Baptist churches who are willing to say, yes, we see that one of the reasons we have the issues that we have in our communities is because families are not being formed in ways that they used to. And I, as a pastor, as a leader in my community, believe that I have something to do about it.
I was raised at 12th Baptist Church in Boston, where Dr. King was a reverend, and I had that experience. But I had an experience like in Pop's memoir. He tells this story. And Pop, can you just tell this story about you and the speak in tongues? Well, I had a similar thing to that, but Pop, can you tell this story of that?
Yeah, I don't know if Delano has read the book, but in any case, if I repeat myself, forgive me.
It's all good.
So I've been saved and I have become a fledgling member of this dynamic, charismatic, Pentecostal congregation, although it's not the denomination, it was AME, but praying in tongues, speaking in tongues, and all that. And I had yet to I had been baptized, but I had yet to receive the baptism in the Holy Spirit, where, as in the book of Acts, I am empowered to heal and interpret tongues and speak in tongues and prophesy. And the congregants, it's a small Bible study group that we were at the end of the lesson and praying to close the meeting. And Sister Arlene says, Brother Glenn, you're coming along in the faith, man. I think it's time, receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit. We're going to pray for you, right now in the name of Jesus. We're going to pray for you to let his power come down and anoint you so that you can witness to the, etc. And they start praying over me to be baptized in the Holy Spirit, which evidence of which was going to be expressed by me speaking in tongues. And they're praying and they're praying and they're praying. And they're praying, man. And they're not going to stop praying until a miracle happens, because they know that the Lord is in where 2 or 3 of us are gathered in his name, etc.
Right.
And under the pressure, I actually, in effect, fake being anointed by the Holy Spirit, because I begin to babble in tongues by my light. I'm speaking in tongues now because I want them to stop praying and I want it to come to an end. I mean, it's going on for 30 minutes, That's the story. I'm not proud of it, but it's called Confessions of a Black Conservative. That's the subtitle of my book, and that's one of my confessions.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
why'd you have me tell that story, Rob?
Because it's a great story, and it happened to me. I mean, when I was 16, they're ready to baptize me in the Lord and all that, and I was like, the water's cold. Isn't the repast in like 10 minutes? Like, I was like, it broke me of believing. Obviously, I studied science as well, which also broke me, but it made me say, this place, we're still doing voodoo rituals, from 2,000 years ago. And today we live in the first century, this century, where the church, our society has changed. We don't go out. We don't gather. We don't do all of these things. And I'm saying, I believe that you're onto something big time, because the problem in my mind is that we have to rebrand patriarchy. Now, and I think that that's the real issue here. And so I wrote an article about this, and I say the word from now on, let's change the name of patriarchy to trustee, because I run a family trust. I'm the third generation to run the same trust. And it just seems like let's try to take all the gender crap out of the way so that these women folk will listen to us without feeling like we're just, lording power, so to speak. And my theory is we got to rebrand patriarchy. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me start here. I'm deeply skeptical, particularly of any man who uses patriarchy as a pejorative. I get this all the time on the left, on the progressive left. So when they say patriarchy, they are always thinking about male domination and abuse. The irony is that when they talk about the benefits of Black women leading and matriarchy, even if they don't use the term, it's all upside, right? So for them, when men lead, it's all downside. When women lead, it's all upside. But I do agree that we need to return to a household dynamic where men take their rightful place as being responsible for their households. Now, when I think about that term, whether it's patriarchy or in sort of biblical circles, they'll talk about household dynamics between a husband and a wife. I'm thinking about the responsibility that I have. Now, the reason that this is important is because, as I said, sometimes people will reach for androgynous egalitarianism. They want to wipe away any gender differences and say that everybody plays the same role. But no society that I'm aware of teaches its adult women that it is their responsibility to take care of an adult male and the children that they have together. None that I'm aware of, right? So men have a particular role. And for me, when I think about my household, I think about the responsibility that I carry on my shoulders to provide for, protect my wife and children, and not just in terms of financial, provision, but in many things. There's certain ideas that I want to keep out of my household. There's certain things that I want to expose my children to or not expose my children to. So yes, I think marriage in general needs a rebrand, which again, speaking to solutions and the art house, I would love to get in contact, and I've reached out to Burrell Communications that was started by a Black man in 1971 in Chicago. They do a lot of product development. They do branding, for products. And I reached out to one of their creative directors and say, do you do brand campaigns for initiatives, right? Because I think marriage needs a rebrand. And I think doing that through social media, the places where young people are now, because I can tell both of you gentlemen, I have an account on Threads, which is connected to Instagram. And every time I go on Threads, something pops up where I'm paraphrasing, but some woman will say, Black women don't need husbands. We have our own money. We're independent. Men are a drag. Marriage only benefits men. So there's a consistent bombardment of negative propaganda around marriage. And I think one of the problems, and this is indicative on the right in general, is that even people on the right have difficulty speaking to the differences in gender and the different roles and responsibilities that men and women have in the family and have in the society. So I'll close this thought this way. If a woman stands up and says that she manages a large, complex organization, everyone will cheer her, unless she says it's her home. If she says, right? If she says and if she says she's dedicated to educating the next generation of kids, they will cheer her, unless it's her own children. So in effect, while feminism promises women access to any decision that they want, in effect, there's been a thumb on the scale for 60 plus years, diminishing the vocations of wife and mother for women. And I think something similar, both through policy and culture, where we diminish the vocations of husband and father for men.
Wow.
Let me ask you something in the same spirit of Rob. He wants to know about the church and their influence, a waning influence. I want to know about Hollywood.
Mm.
I mean, you're a film director, Robert.
Mhm.
What about the power of the screen, of the story, of the fiction that people entertain themselves with, of the fairy tale?
Well,
You wouldn't say, because viewership might be down going to the movies relative to what it was 30 years ago, that there was no power there. Uh, the performer has power to influence the popular culture. And it's a lever like that, it seems to me, that Delano is trying to push.
yeah. To answer that directly, yeah, Hollywood is way more powerful than Black church will ever be. It's way more powerful than anyone can understand, because the art form is to get you, the audience, to suspend your disbelief. And
Right.
that's what we teach. And so we're telling you, this isn't real, but it's real and you're a part of it. So of course we will always dominate, but it's a new thing. We've only had this power probably 70 years. So it's kind of new in terms of being human, which brings me to the point that I wanted to ask you, Pop, because you were there, you were young. But the one play that we all read in public education is Raisin in the Sun. And when Raisin in the Sun came out in 1959, if you look at what the plot is about, you have the patriarch has died. There's a pot of resources. How do the resources get divided? The son wants to be a capitalist and buy a business, the only business in the neighborhood that makes money, the liquor store. You got the daughter, she wants to go to college, right? And marry an African prince. Okay, ooh, where's this come from, right? And then you have Big Mama who's like, no, I want to go and integrate a white neighborhood where we can have a chance at something. So I think the actual moment and the 1950s that we're all talking about, certainly within our culture, is because we read Raisin in the Sun like it's the Bible. I would say more kids read Raisin in the Sun because it's part of the public school education than they do the Bible. What are your thoughts?
I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I like the play. I identify with Walter Lee Younger, with his frustration, with his ambition. I agree with you about the African prince. I mean, you had to be there. It was the 1950s, post-colonial, Second World War is over. The African countries are gaining independence. The Black elite, the Afrotocracy, are enamored of the Kwame Nkrumahs and so forth. And wanting a nice house in the suburbs. I don't think her motive was to integrate a white community as much as she just wanted a nice house with a yard where she could put a flower pot on the windowsill. And those houses happened to be in Chicago in the 1950s in a mostly white neighborhoods. So, you know.
Let me give you a little context on that.
I thought Lorraine Hansberry hit a home run with that play at that time, but it's not a Bible for how Black people should be living, you know.
Let me give you a little bit of extra context, Pop, though.
Okay, do so quickly because we're running out of time.
I can't be rushed, Pop. No, I'm just joking. That was a reaction because her father sued a white community a decade or so before she wrote the play because of the regulations that were in the code for this community that Blacks weren't allowed.
Restrictive covenants and stuff.
Restrictive covenants. So she was very purposely doing it, and she was very purposely saying that Big Mama, Aunt Jemima, because, you know, this is when Pinky came out, was shortly before that. It was a very, very pointed piece of media or art to say Big Mama's always right. And I think that that's something that we need to think about that.
Where my hat? Remember that end of that scene where she's looking for a hat? She's storming out. She's angry. Yeah, that's pretty good. We're at the end of the hour. Delano, you want to add a final word before I bring Mark Sussman back on for some housekeeping?
I'll say this. I think media is an extremely powerful tool for shaping perception. Sometimes self-perception, perception of opposite sex, perception of family as a priority, as a good, as a public good. I have an entire chapter entitled "Reject Destructive Media." Now, I focus more so on music because as an 80s baby growing up in New York City in the 1990s, I got to see sort of the rise of, you know, a particular type of hip hop. And what I argue, sort of the top line of that chapter, is that you cannot sow Snoop Dogg and reap the Huxtables, right? So if you want intact families with positive dynamics, we as Black people cannot continue to promote media and media imagery lyrics that degrade Black women, that sow seeds of discord between Black men and Black women, that promote violence, promote drug abuse, and think that it won't have some effect. Now, I'm not blaming hip hop artists for the state of the Black family. What I'm saying is, oftentimes the issues that we're talking about between men and women, the music has become a soundtrack for those issues. And particularly in communities where the family structure has begun to dissolve, you have to ask yourself, okay, why would a young man, 24 years old on the south side of Chicago today, right? Parents not married, grandparents not married, no one, he's in O Block, he's in a rough neighborhood. Why would he think I need to give her a ring before I give her a baby? When everything that's been sort of inundating him, all the messaging has been telling him that young woman is sexually promiscuous, she's disagreeable, she's not the type of person that you treat like a queen, she's the type of person that you use for your own pleasure and throw away. So I think we need better imagery in movies, television, and this is the big one. Because of how people consume information and entertainment today, a much bigger part of this media discussion has to be focused on social media, new media, podcasts. Glenn, I love what you do, because having a wise elder speaking to issues of substance with, again, the benefit of decades behind his back and with a certain moral authority is far different than what I see on other podcasts. Sometimes with people older than me who are asking people, man, tell me about that threesome you had back in the day. Yeah, let's talk about, or the men saying, women are terrible, we give up on marriage, we don't want that. Or the women saying, I don't need a man, I just need my own money. So if you're a person, particularly a young person, anybody under the age of 30 really, who consumes podcasts and social media as your primary source of information, you are being constantly bombarded with imagery and messaging that will make it more difficult to form loving, lifelong, and lasting family bonds with the opposite sex.
Speaking of loving and lifelong, we're over time now. We're past the 2-hour mark, but we're going to just close by giving my lovely wife, Lawan, who has been active in the comments, I'm told, an opportunity to contribute to our discussion via Mark, who is curating the comments section. Mark, you want to come back on and convey some of my wife's sentiments?
Nope. That is something that you can discuss with your wife when we are no longer streaming, because I am not going to be the one who conveys that message. I'm not getting in the middle of this.
Oh, in the middle. Oh, so it's personal. She's coming after me, is she?
No. I mean, I don't know. Look, again, not my thing. It's not. I'm not getting involved.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm looking at the chat here, and it's saying that absolutely we should give her a shout out. So we gave her
a shout out in terms of like the details of what's going on in the chat. That's something that you can discuss with the one. I'm not going to be the one to get up here and absorb what comes my way.
I got you.
I do not get paid for that. In fact, I could not be paid enough for that. There is no amount of money that.
Well, the chat is public. Everybody can see it, can't they?
I'm just saying, I don't like you. You're gonna yell at me. I don't want to get yelled at.
All right. Well, I'll take the yelling.
Anyway, thanks so much, everybody, for watching this stream. You have been
Delano.
watching the Glenn Show live. Thank you so much, Delano, for coming on.
Thank you for having
me. This has been a free stream. It has been a free stream. This is just a little taste of what you get if you become a subscriber to glennlowry.substack.com. That is how we keep the lights on. Go on, become a full subscriber, support our project, keep us going. We can't do what we do without you. And with that, thank you so much and goodbye.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thank you, Rob, for your contribution. And thank you, Delano, for the book and for the work that you're doing. Keep it up.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate you.